Harry, first of all, thank you for joining us. Just to kind of kick us off, would you mind walking us through the kind of earliest roots of child protection and what you thought were some of the kind of moral and social forces at play before kind of the more formal child protection systems began and emerged?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for having me on. Yeah, and it's really nice to have this opportunity to talk about the history of social work and the history of child protection. And yeah, I think that the usual starting point in the literature and in sort of everyday discussion about these things is, the so-called discovery of child abuse in the 1960s with the battered child syndrome, all sorts of, significant developments since the 60s and 70s. But the real starting point for professional social work and child protection practice is the late 19th century, the 1880s or 1890s. So in the UK, the key organization was the National Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children, and of course the NSPCC, still a leading charity today. So they began in Liverpool. In the first local branch society started in 1884, and then a London society started up, and it became the NSPCC in 1889. And the first significant piece of legislation was the 1889 Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act. So the NSPCC was a classic kind of pressure group campaigning to have child cruelty recognized as a social problem, to have it legislated for. They were highly successful, highly successful. Yeah, so the first social workers emerged on the streets, NSPCC inspectors from the 80s, and things evolved from there.
And Harry, as we said in the intro, Rich and I have read your book, Protecting Children in Time. And in that book, so you went deep into the archive, the NSPCC records, actually, didn't you? And that material is in the book, and it's fascinating. And why did you do that?
Well, yeah, I used to work for the NSPCC. I started my social work career with the NSPCC in the late 1970s. I actually trained with them. They had a 1-year training course based in London. So I was an NSPCC inspector, and I had an inspector's directory, as all NSPCC social workers did. I didn't wear a uniform, though.
Did you have a bike? Did you have a bike, Harry?
I didn't have a bike. I had a Mini, actually. They provided cars for us.
Wow, really?
So I was running around West Yorkshire investigating child abuse cases, working with children and families during the late 70s, and I became aware of there being an archive, an NSPCC archive of old case records and reports, to do with produced by the annual reports that they'd been producing since the beginning. And I decided to do a PhD. And when I did my social work degree, I became very interested in the history of social policy and the history of social work. And because I knew the organization well, and they knew me a bit, I'd no bother at all getting access to this archive. And so I spent well over a year in the NSPCC archives in London.
And you give that a real full and really treatment in the book. And I've got a quote here so this is an inspector writing in 1908. And so this is a case records, an inspector writing, "I've known this case since June 1908, off and on, and to my knowledge, they've been in 9 houses. She gets a house and stays in it until things get hot, and then she moves. She has 3 children in industrial schools for stealing. It's one of the most difficult homes to get into. And many a time I've gone there 3 or 4 times and been unable to get in. She's a terror to landlords and the police, a bother to the school board. I've told her that she'll be getting into my net someday. She says, no fear, I'll watch that." So it's amazing how, that's very evocative, isn't it? A case record, and there'll be some features that we recognise on the modern case records, but also there's that tinge of history and Victorian values to it as well.
Yeah, totally. And so I found these case records that I found went right back to the beginning, to the late 1880s, 1890s. And what I think, there was a kind of like that quote, Tim, exemplifies a sort of an emotional honesty and a judgmental quality to them, which I think social workers today would kind of balk at. But, one of the things that I think social workers today have a lot more in common than they possibly realize with the old NSPCC inspectors. There's a lot that we wouldn't want to agree with or endorse about their language and their classism and sexism. It was a highly patriarchal practice, this, it fell very, very heavily on mothers. But they had a passion for trying to help children. And, and there's so much I could say about what they did, but there are core practices that social workers engage in today that were created in this period, between the 1880s and the early decades of the 20th century. And I became absolutely fascinated by the home visit. And, I was running around in the 80s doing home visits myself, as you know better than I do. That's where social work goes on today. That's where child and family social work, fundamentally, it's a key site, isn't it? So many of the core kind of practices and rituals that social workers engage with in today, and the kind of relational issues, which are kind of, within that quote, Tim, sort of, the tussles between social workers and parents trying to get into homes. The first NSPCC directors, which was kind of their sort of practice guide, suggested that inspectors needed to develop the art of seeing through walls. So I never taught that, actually, in my many years of social work education.
You never managed that? You never learnt that trick, Harry? No.
No, seeing through walls. I think there's a public expectation that social workers can see through walls.
Yeah. But there is something important there, isn't there, about space and, as you say, the family home and that that threshold. And what you said about I mentioned bikes earlier, bicycles, and there's a passage in there where an inspector cycles 100 miles to visit three and it sort of tracks the technology, and actually with the advent of bicycles and then later cars, I guess, that there was that ability to actually get out and about and be in the community and reach people. And I know in your later work, beautiful ethnographic illustrations of social workers driving onto estates in their cars, and
I think, the context in which I became interested in the history was at a time in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, when there was a real explosion of kind of revisionist historical work on core, welfare, health and social care practices. So you had all these really interesting histories of the prisons, psychiatric institutions. You had the work of Michel Foucault on prisons, mental health, lots of, work being done on the history of psychiatry. And this idea of a history of the present was very powerful at the time. So there was so much for me to tap into intellectually and methodologically at that time. So in a way, what I kind of saw myself as trying to do was explore the birth of child protection, really, and trace its development right through into the present. So And that is completely bound up with technological developments. And the bicycle actually is one of the most significant inventions in terms of like social impact, cultural impact. As you've just articulated, Tim, it changed, it accelerated practice, and the car that, the motorbike. So I was reading about NSPCC inspectors in the 30s, really celebrating the fact that they could move at even greater speed to get, to see children more quickly over, further distances. Then you have the emergence of the car and the 90s. So the title of the book, Protecting Children in Time, tries to capture two things. That's a sort of the historical dimension of protecting children in time, which, tracing the roots of child protection and so on. But there's also, what I was really interested in trying to figure out was where does this idea come from that social workers not only can, but they should be able to protect children in time, in the sense of, stopping them from dying, stopping them from experiencing harm. So with all these kinds of technological developments in science and so on, what I tried to do in the book was trace the emergence of that idea that, it was possible to reach children in time, and to develop the kind of relationships where, concealed abuse within family homes, for instance, could be identified and, children, kept safe.
And then that time-bound system develops where the child protection system is running on explicitly on time and time-bound processes and assessments, etc. Yeah.
And so there's like, the issue of child, I think, the issue of, so like one of the things that staggered me when I went into the archives was the number of children who were dying in child protection cases in these early years. And so in these case records, I was regularly reading about NSPCC inspectors finding children who were dead, like in family homes. I wrote it down just in preparation from the book. Between 1884 and 1914, 13,613 children died in NSPCC cases. What that means is these were children who died in cases that the NSPCC were involved in. And, I was finding this out at a time when one child dying was regarded as a scandal. As everyone listening to this will be extremely familiar with, we have this phenomenon of child abuse inquiries and serious case reviews and so on that's been going on since the mid-1970s. So when a single child dies, there's a public outcry and so on. It was an absolute revelation to me to find that child death was normal. And the NSPCC used to actually regard finding dead children actually as a sign of success, because it meant that they were reaching more families and rooting out child cruelty. But when you actually, what I sort of found myself having to do was, put it in the context of the time. And at the end of the 19th century, when, thousands of children were being found to have died in NSPCC cases, the infant mortality rate, the number of children who were dying within the first year of life, was higher than at any time in the entire 19th century, throughout the 1800s. So 1 in 3 children were dying at that time within the first year of life. So one of the things I kind of concluded was that NSPCC inspectors were coming across children who were dying anyway. Yeah. It wasn't that all these parents were killing these children. Public health problems were massive. Yeah. So this is all about poverty and inequality, disadvantage, incredibly poor housing, poor sanitary conditions, lots of diseases, and, just families living in such poverty that they just couldn't feed their children. Yeah.
And there was a kind of, what I found fascinating about when you track the history of children dying, there was a kind of, the NSPCC at one point were using child deaths in part to evidence the success of the kind of child protection enterprise at that period of time. And then there was this kind of shift where the way in which child death was represented changed, really, from being like publicly visible to a kind of institutional secret. And there was a couple of reasons for that. One was, well, I can't remember what the NSPCC's motivations were, but there was also, it was partly influenced by a more kind of societal push towards pushing death behind closed doors and institutionalizing it through, whereas before people used to die at home and stuff like that, they were now dying in hospitals and other places. So it was part of a kind of broader social shift, but there was also a definite change in the way that NSPCC were reporting child death incidences.
Yeah, that's a fantastic summary of a number of complicated sociological developments over time. Children continued to die in NSPCC cases until the mid-1930s, and they were making it public. They were making those deaths public. They produced statistics, annual statistics on the number of children who died. So, in the book, I've got tables of the number of children who died annually, right through from 1915 to 1936. They stopped making this information public in 1936. And what you see is a gradual reduction over time in the number of child deaths in NSPCC casework. But there were still 200-300 children a year dying, and it was being made public in the 90s. So I became curious about, well, what happened? Why did they stop publicizing the deaths of children? And Anthony Giddens, he was professor of sociology at Cambridge, where I did my PhD, wrote brilliantly about this around the same time that I was doing the research. And he came up with this concept of sequestration, which is a kind of sociological process that describes just what you've said there, Rich, a process where personal problems that cause any kind of distress or anxiety, like death or mental illness, were pushed to the margins of consciousness, of everyday consciousness, locked away in institutions. Death itself, the great leveler, ceased to take place in the home, but was like now happening in hospitals. Yeah, because you have the the development of health services, the NHS, and so on, post-war, and so on. Number of Giddens and other sociologists have written about how the self, through the 20th century, the self, our sense of what they call ontological security, our sense of security in our everyday well-being, became dependent on us not hearing about or seeing distressing things or even knowing about them. So the public didn't want to know about child deaths anymore. This is what the NSPCC copped onto in the mid-1930s.
Mm.
And a key dimension of this was the need to promote trustworthiness in experts. Yeah. So the NSPCC narrative completely changed. The child protection narrative completely changed from one where they were celebrating their capacity to find dead children who died, Some of them did die from, parental abuse and cruelty and neglect and so on. But as I say, a lot of them were highly vulnerable children due to social circumstances, inequality and, poverty and so on. So the narrative completely changed to one where they began to promote their capacity to stop children from dying. So it no longer became acceptable for them to highlight the fact that they were finding dead children, that there were children dying, that there were children dying from child abuse at all. And their casework, their promotion of their casework and their social value became dependent on them trying to convince people and believing in this as well, believing in their capacity to protect children in time. Yeah. And then you have all sorts of, interesting and significant political, social developments that occurred from the 1960s and 70s, where knowledge of child abuse deaths started to leak out into public, and the first key example of that was the Maria Colwell inquiry in 1975 in England. So in the context of there being no public discourse at all about the fact that children died in child protection casework, the fact that social workers actually and other professionals actually did fail to protect children, and this was a routine part of their work, although it had become a very, very, small number of practitioners who would actually experience this. The fact that that was sort of like historically was, a routine thing wasn't known about. It was like, that this reflected some decline in social work practice, which was completely untrue. So all sorts of things began to happen then where that social workers are still profoundly feeling the effects of, in terms of, the extent to which they're regarded as competent, trustworthy. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the profound impact of this, these supposedly unique historical events on the social work profession and our understandings of what is possible for social workers to do, and trust in social workers and so on. Because what social workers became, I need to make this point, otherwise I'll forget it. It's so important that social work became a kind of a container for social anxiety. I think it's very valuable to talk about the whole thing about containment and anxiety and the social and political function of organizations like social work, to contain the public's anxieties about to help people cope with the fact that children are harmed. And there are limits to the extent to which they can be protected.
And I think what happened from reading the book is that where there was this period of absence of reporting of child deaths, there was also further developments in terms of society's view towards children, in terms of them becoming increasingly precious or sacred and deserved of being taken care of. So there was a cultural and societal shift towards attitudes towards children. And that was in part because of it being post-war, and there was a renewed focus on, I suppose, value in life in the context of all of that loss. And then also there was the development of the child protection system into its more increasingly modern form, which was kind of motivated under the belief that actually we could increasingly identify children at risk because we now have these new technologies that allow us to transport in and around the country, and that we would be able to find them and respond to them. So then it was a kind of coalescing of these factors of Maria Colwell in the context of renewed focus on children and a kind of high expectation about what the child protection system would ultimately be able to do. And you talk about how there was a kind of the fantasy of total transparency in child protection, and that you also mentioned that most professionals will never encounter a child death in their careers. It's very rare. I can think of, I've been doing the job 15 years, and I can think of maybe one social worker in all of that time that's experienced that, and actually it was an adolescent. And yet the fear of missing something is more pervasive than ever. And the paradox of that, which you point out, is that this is at a time when child deaths are occurring at the least amount of time they've ever occurred in the whole of history, essentially.
Yeah, the core paradox of this history and of child protection culturally is that trust in social workers and the whole kind of expert system around child protection has never been lower at a time when it's never been safer to be a child. There's all kinds of qualifiers that are needed there because, as we all know, child abuse as a social problem has evolved in all kinds of ways where there are new dangers and risks to children. And there are, incredibly significant new discoveries and new awareness that has arisen around child sexual exploitation in recent years, for instance. Dangers of the internet and computers and all kinds of, vulnerabilities that children are exposed to around all that. So there are real social problems and reasons to be worried about the safety of children. But viewed historically, I think it's an overall, the overall trajectory is the story is one of huge success, really, huge impact. Like, we've got an incredibly elaborate, sophisticated child protection system in this country. And as you said there, Rich, and you put it so eloquently, it's just really odd, isn't it? And bizarre that, despite that, and my research that I've continued to do, into current day child protection over the last number of years and even decades now, because I'm so old, shows that, something else happened that, post-war around a new risk anxiety that emerged for professionals and for social workers, blaming systems. I think there's a way into this in terms of thinking about risk as a concept and blaming systems. Ulrich Beck, who was a brilliant German sociologist who wrote an incredibly successful, popular book that was published in English in 1992 called Risk Society, wrote incredibly significant, important things about this. And so since the 1980s, we're living in a risk society, and where a new kind of risk anxiety has emerged that's about what he calls a scapegoat society. Yeah. So suddenly, if you're the social worker who's had the misfortune to be involved in a situation where a child has died, you're the one who gets blamed. We've seen a lot of public anger towards parents, in these kinds of situations. But the professionals involved, particularly social workers, become the ones who are like the bad objects, culturally. They're the ones that, society, because there's been a failure of containment of social anxiety. Social workers' job is to keep children safe and to protect people from knowing anything about the suffering that children experience in this kind of, world that we live in. And when they fail to do that, people get angry and they need somebody to blame. So they blame professionals. They blame the social worker. And the blaming has become more and more extreme and horrendous, as we know. Social workers involved in these cases. The media have been crucial in this, of course. Social workers having to move house, being persecuted, spat at, on the streets. It's absolutely appalling. And it's been made worse by leaders, social work leaders and managers going publicly, certainly in the early days of the child abuse inquiries, and saying this will never happen again. Look, it will happen again, I'm afraid.
Is that you do say at one stage in the book, the title is Protecting Children in Time, or failing to. And is that what you're getting at there, that it's not possible to ensure safety?
No, you can't guarantee child safety. I mean, think about how much time social workers spend with families. Like, it's just a snapshot they get of people's lives. That's, going back to the earlier conversation, this is the fantasy of total transparency of family life. Not Ulrich Beck, another German sociologist who I've fallen in love with. It's Hartmut Rosa. Written a brilliant book called Resonance, but he writes about controllability as what he calls controllability as a key dynamic of advanced modern societies and cultures. And this assumption that underpins, what is expected of professionals like social workers, that they can control what goes on in people's lives. But we know that most of family life is lived, privately. And, I think social workers and the sort of whole multi-agency system has become extremely skilled and knowledgeable about risk to children, professional curiosity, the need for multi-agency communication, et cetera, et cetera. We know all this, don't we? But, at the core of this are vulnerable imperfect human beings. And human beings are constituted by, a huge capacity to care and to love, as you've, written and spoken a huge amount about, and, your relational activism work and so on. Uh, it's lovely to see love emerging as a sort of a distinct kind of discourse in social work and social care. And I think you've had a huge amount to do with that. But there's also, the capacity for destructiveness and hate, so we're not, nobody can resolve that. That's at the core of our humanity.
Well, it gets. Actually, you write at the start about that in the book you want to get at the heart and soul and the smell of child protection practice. I love this quote talking about it's kind of you to mention that to love is to act slogan, but I thought this was very nicely written in the book here. Harry writes, if we are to properly understand the modern character of child protection, it is crucial that we begin to conceive of its practices as they are practiced, on the run, without movement, somebody getting up from their desk, leaving the office and doing something. There is no protection.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what would I know you differentiate between when you bring in Foucault and Foucault's ideas about power and control, but you take a different position, a slightly different position on that, and you want to bring in more the smell, the embodied experience, and the individual experience into your view of child protection practices. Harry, is that fair to say?
No, that's absolutely spot on. I can see that you both read this book.
We did say we were gonna. We did our homework.
I can now go to my grave knowing I had at least 2 readers. Well, I actually got really interested in the senses, and child protection. The narrative, the discourse is very visual, isn't it? Seeing the child, supervision, supervising, surveillance, so there's been a lot of kind of social science around embodiment over the last 20, 30 years. And I kind of learned a lot from that. From the earliest days of these case records I was looking at, social workers complained about the smells in going into families' homes and like, the whole impact of dirt and sort of contamination fears. So you have these early social workers worrying about, catching nits from families, and children were talked about as objects of disgust. Actually, it's a really painful aspect of our history here. Children were talked about. There was actually, a passage in the old inspector's directory that was only, I tracked this through, that was only eliminated in the 1960s about what to do when you handle a dead child, and to use, they recommended using carbolic soap to scrub, especially under your fingernails, So, there were contamination fears around working with, and there was a whole kind of othering of these families that went on at the same time. They were seen as morally dangerous. They were, the NSPCC used to police the slums, as they called them. So there was a construction of the problem family, that social workers were involved with, where these families were like regarded as a social danger and potentially, morally and like physically, contaminating. And actually, one of the things I found is that even with the foundation of the welfare state and a more, attempts to develop a more equal society, that discourse did not change. If anything, it hardened. Children in care, these children, when they were taken into care, they were shipped away to, Australia, Canada. They were like excluded, socially excluded, in the interests of creating a morally pure, ridding our culture of these contaminating objects, these young people who grow up to be criminals and produce more child abusing parents and so on and so forth. And if you look at the contemporary discourse around child protection, I think like the tragic case of Victoria Colombier in the early 2000s, social workers refused to visit her in the flat that she lived in London because she had scabies. And in this, and in the work that I've done with social workers in the last 15 years, where I've observed their practice and so on, the smell of practice, the embodied experience of going into people's homes, especially when it's child neglect, is just as problematic for them as it was 100 years ago, 120 years ago. And one of the things I've tried to argue over the years is that, it's absolutely vital, yes, that we have like poverty-aware social work. I think one of the achievements of our profession is its value base and its, compassion towards people who've been excluded and rendered into these untouchable objects, bad objects in society and so on. The way our profession humanizes the suffering of vulnerable people and is willing to work with those people and help them. But social workers, and Rich, you write about this in your fantastic book, Messy Social Work, about the impact of going into people's homes on your sense of self, so we have our own bodily boundaries and capacity. There are limits to our kind of ability as human beings to absorb foul smells. And, social workers worry about sitting down on soiled settees and, dogs jumping on them and weeing on them, growling at them and all the rest of it. The reason we need to engage with these realities is because they potentially create distance between social workers, children, and families. So recognizing emotions like disgust, recognize the impact of the smell of practice and the impact, of going into people's homes and environments. So it has on the subjectivity of the social worker is absolutely important to me. That's my argument anyway. These are difficult subjects to address, aren't they? Because invariably, you're working with families who are poor and so on, marginalized. Yeah. And there's all sorts of issues about middle-class social workers, judging working class families, etc. Sorry, Rich, you wanted to come in?
No, I was just going to say, I think this is why I appreciate your writing so much, because one of the things you talk about is that there's a kind of strand of theorizing about welfare, which tends to come from the political left, which focuses on the kind of oppressive or limited resources of the child protection offer. But the problem with that kind of critical perspective you point out is that it's kind of unidimensional or one-dimensional, and it kind of overlooks what it's not like the client or the service user or the parent is like a passive client. In fact, in some of that literature, it tends to be that the parent is idealized and they can do no wrong, when in fact social workers' experiences of trying to offer help and trying to support parents is that it's met with a degree of hostility or aggression, or as you point out then about, you're going into houses where there might be certain smells or certain feelings are evoked by, in terms of fear or disgust. And unless we have like an honest conversation about those, they're just going to interfere in all sorts of ways in our capacity to do the job effectively. So it doesn't actually serve social workers to frame it in that particular way. We need to, not get caught in these kind of binaries where there's like the good client, bad system kind of dualism that gets played out.
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to say something, Tim?
Yeah, I was just going to illustrate that with, there's a nice quote in the book, and this is Mrs. Jones. I think she's asked, what does the social worker think of you? Mrs. Jones says, probably that I'm a bitch, but then again, I was told on the other side to get assertive and be more open. they didn't like me when I was quiet, and they certainly don't like it if I agree with anything. And then I don't see why I should agree everything with them. So like that double bind that the parent might be in of, they want to be open and honest, but they also are trying to, and maybe that what we've talked about there's I could say a reflexive position there that parents having, and their view of child protection as a system. And I was interested in that, tracing through that when child protections, and I think it's described as like self-referential, again going back maybe to the Giddens and the Beck ideas, and we use that as in the abstract all the time, don't we? We sort of talk about the system, and the public has a view on it, as you've said. But also, what do you think about the way that child protection itself articulates its work, and that idea that it's a sort of self-referential system that creates some of its own problems?
Yeah, thanks for referencing Mrs. Jones. She also went on to point out social workers are always telling her to clean up her house, her home, but you should see the state of their cars, you know.
Good on her,
So
Mrs.
these
Jones.
are,
Yeah.
these are power
Yeah.
relationships, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly, yeah, cars.
Well, cars is a motif for
Yes.
your writing, isn't it, Harry? Yeah.
Well, like something about keeping your own house in order or something.
Well, it's sort of like, I think you're right, actually. I know I'm quoting a lot from the book, but it helps me to try to reckon with the ideas. But you say the problems of risk management in child protection come to concern hazards brought about by the development of the expert system itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ulrich Beck in Risk Society talks about manufactured risk, which basically refers to the fact that, in a sense, as we've been sort of talking about, child protection has become a victim of its own success in a way. People expect social workers to be able to have this total transparency of everyday life. Politicians, the state sort of has this kind of very kind of, sort of expects an all-seeing gaze, I remember a minister for children and families in the new Labour government actually saying in an interview, she said, this government has not lost control of teenage sexuality, she said. Not lost control of teenage pregnancy, that was it. I thought, can any government control anybody's desire to get pregnant, or so there's this sort of, again, this kind of like underpinning assumption that it's possible to govern the absolute core of citizens' lives, and it's increasing. This is getting worse. I think it's obviously not. It's there is more surveillance, isn't there? Is this country got the most CCTV cameras of any country in the world or something? We are subject to all kinds of, authoritarian tendencies in terms of how we're ruled and governed. But within the child protection sphere, the way that social work has become regulated and managed over the last 20, 30 years has manufactured more risk for social workers, I think, in terms of, ramping up the expectations. So you have two things going on here, well, several things going on, but two that, I can probably have time to highlight. And one is, this whole kind of fear of failure and this whole improvement narrative, So, have Ofsted have been crucial in all of this, the whole kind of regulatory culture, the whole new managerialism that came in the 80s, 90s. You have this massive expansion of, managers, we all know that supervision is vital. Going back to the early conversation, managing the emotional dimensions of social work, absolutely fundamentally important to, social workers actually recognizing that, the nature of their dynamics of their relationships with children, with parents, and so on. But as we know, it's the dominant discourse, isn't it, in social work now? It's overmanaged. It's, the also all the target audit culture. And even when you do well, even if you get an outstanding, Ofsted, you got to maintain that. You got to keep improving. It's never good enough. Yeah. And so there's this whole kind of anxiety around, maintaining how good you are. I mean, of course, there is some kind of positive benefit to this in terms of services. There's a whole other discussion here about inspection and so on, isn't there? And what do inspection judgments actually, show that organizations are good at? Like, is it that they're good at being inspected, or they're good at actually? When Matthew Gibson and I observed Ofsted inspectors, actually we got consent to do observations of inspections. They never went near families. Yeah, as you write about rich and messy social work, it's so much of what's regarded as good and outstanding or not good or inadequate is based on what is written down, what is articulated. So this is how this risk anxiety continues to be manufactured. But my argument, it feels like I've been writing about this since the 1880s. My argument that I've been banging out for 35 years now is that, and I've got another book coming out where I say it again and again, is, you got to get close to practice. That's where, we need to be. We need to, researchers, politicians, senior managers, Ofsted inspectors, they need to experience the smell of practice. Like, they need to be able to, they need to know what it's like viscerally, to knock on doors. Yeah. To feel scared as you're walking up the path and hoping the family aren't in, even though you passionately want to try and help those children, you passionately want to try and help those parents. Working with involuntary clients, and I do call them clients because for me, they're not meaningfully service users or experts by experience. They don't want social work involvement. Working with the challenges around trying to, actually get access to children in their homes or other places and so on, work with parents who don't want a service. It's immensely complex and difficult. And that's why, you can't guarantee that you're going to achieve it, and social workers, I've had the privilege of observing, many social workers working effectively through this kind of, through the hostility, developing, effective relationships with troubled parents, and so on, and helping a lot, helping children, protecting children in time, helping them in all sorts of, really important ways. But we can never guarantee that can happen because there's too many real on the ground risks and dangers to the work. And we're human beings and vulnerable professionals and so on. I'm losing the run of myself, as they say.
No, it's
Well,
yeah.
yeah.
It's
And
a lovely
we did,
place, I think, to move on to our 10 questions. Do you reckon, Tim?
yeah, I think so. And just before we do, Harry, you mentioned your forthcoming book. So we're really grateful for this conversation. It's gone in depth, and as me and Rich said, we read it and it was really interesting, fulfilling read, protecting children in time. And you've got a book coming out very soon, Harry. And did you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's called Making Child Protection Work. So it's based on all the kind of research that I've done over the last 10, 15 years, where I've observed social workers in practice interacting with families and children. And I've spent a lot of time in their organizations and social work teams and offices, soaking up the organizational culture. And, basically I in the book, I explore, what do social workers do? How do they do it? Where do they do it? So I'm kind of developing themes that I opened up in the book Child Protection Practice in 2011. But in this new book, Making Children making child protection work, I try to get really, really up close, and observe what goes on in encounters between social workers and families, and link that to what is good supervision, it's all about relationship-based practice, this book, actually, and trying to kind of develop that sort of concept and provide some resources for social workers and students and so on to learn about ways of being able to make child protection work, in the sense of producing good outcomes for children.
Yes, another evocative title, and we'll put a pre-order link to that in the notes underneath the podcast, and yes, everybody watch this space on that book coming out. So we like to do like this 10.
Well, thanks ever so much for that. Honestly, that's really kind of you.
Well, we now, Harry, we got these so this is 10 questions. It's a bit of a change of pace. Is that okay? We can edit this little bit if we need a moment of decompression.
Is this the personal disclosure bit?
So should we give this a go? So we're thinking about sort of like 10 questions.
Go for it.
Roughly in 10 minutes, yeah, and do a bit of a quick fire. All right. Do you want to go first, Rich?
Yeah, okay. So question number 1 is, why do you think ethnographic research is important?
Because ethnographic research is about participant observation, means participating in the events that you're interested in studying. So it means basically getting close to practice. And it's something that hasn't been done very much in social work, and it needs to happen because, we can learn from interviewing social workers and children and families. We can learn from surveys, or there's other research methods, but we got to get close to, getting close to seeing what goes on and feeling it. Sensory ethnography, as Sarah Pink calls it, is such a valuable method because
sensory ethnography. Wow.
Sensory ethnography, because that's the kind of ethnography observation I've tried to do, where going in as a researcher and not only sort of observing using your eyes, but using all of your senses to feel the atmosphere. Atmospheres are so important in social work, aren't they? Where you sense of we just feel very welcoming. Oh, what's going on here? There's something not right about this. Yeah, so it's a way of trying to surface the experience of doing the work and the implications of that, and what is good practice.
Harry, do you have a favourite book?
Well, I'm currently very taken with Hartmut Rosa's book Resonance, a sociology book, which is about our relationship to the world. But probably my favourite book, social science book of all time, is a book by Marshall Berman called All That's Solid Melts into Air. The subtitle is The Experience of Modernity. He died must be about 10 years ago now, but he was a New Yorker, and he wrote about the sort of personal and cultural experience of modernization. And I drew a lot on that in terms of helping me to think about how I wrote Protecting Children in Time. So yeah, I love it because it's a book that's about, the dynamic experience of modern life as much as the darker sort of, bureaucratic, suppressive kind of, side of it. So there's a kind of an energy, I'm interested in writing that, communicates the energy of what it's like to experience modern life and relationships. And Berman's book is brilliant at that. And so is Hartmut Rosa's Resonance, which is about the sort of energetic component of relationships. And I write about that in the new book as well.
Thank you.
You write that social workers should use good authority. What do you mean by the term good authority?
I mean that the word good is part of the work that the word good is doing there is because I think it's needed to kind of reclaim power and authority as a legitimate thing for social workers to use. Because, the whole discourse around anti-oppressive practice and empowerment and so on, extremely important. You referred earlier, Rich, to one tendency within social work literature and culture to sort of be quite one-dimensional around relationships and the use of power and oppressive nature of social work and so on. But the reality is that, and this came out, this is absolutely, if you look at the whole history of child protection, as we've been doing over the last hour or so, working with using power and authority is the core dynamic of it. Like, it's at the absolute core of it. And, most people don't want social workers to go into their families, knock on their doors, go into their houses and families and, question their parenting, and so, and it's something that has to be done, in some families. So good authority is about trying to find a language and a sort of way of thinking and that articulates how do you give choice and autonomy to individuals and families while at the same time having to, enforce certain statutory obligations and, requirements in order to insist that you see their children and so on and so forth. So in the new book, Making Child Protection Work, I read about practice by negotiation as being crucial to this. So good authority is about finding ways to negotiate your involvement in ways that are ethical, basically.
Harry, what do you think about social work careers, and what do you do if you've had a varied career? Very interesting one. What makes for an interesting, fulfilling social work career, do you think?
Yeah, I've been sort of really taken with LinkedIn recently. LinkedIn, I don't know, it's not a social media site, a platform, is it? And maybe it's to do with my age, where, I'm kind of recently retired from the university, but I'm still, doing bits and pieces. So I've got a long career to reflect on now, over 40 years in social work, social care. Yeah, so, it's really fascinating looking at people's biographies on LinkedIn, where they say, where they outline their different jobs and roles over the years. So, there is, there's, I don't know, it's obvious, isn't it? That today's social work students and social workers, a lot of them will go on to be like senior leaders in social work, won't they? But some don't. I think I've got such respect for social workers. It's such a challenging job for all the reasons that we've been talking about. But it's also such a rewarding job as well. I absolutely love social work as a profession. And I think I've got particular kind of respect for those who stay at the front line, and there is more research coming out on what it is about these people that enable them to keep thriving and going. And we hear a lot about burnout and retention problem, don't we? But some people dedicate their lives to doing the kind of work we've been talking about. That is what's a good life in social work? That's a good life, I think. And, I just have enormous respect for people who've been able to do that over many, many years. But it's no joke leading a service either. So, yeah, total respect.
In a paper, you used Donald Winnicott's idea of reliable hate objects. Why do you think this concept of reliable hate object is useful within child protection social work?
I thought the 10 questions are going to be like, cats or dogs.
That's a Rich Divine special there.
Celtic or Rangers, like Man United or Man City, And that sort of little joke was kind of Yeah, it's hard to sum that up in a minute, Rich, but
The reason I asked about the reliable hate object is because I do think when I read about that, I thought, oh yeah, that is how I am. That's how I experience being in a relationship with some parents, is that there's a lot of distrust or even hate towards me. And I think naming that and having a concept that allows me to recognize that that's going to be an experience allows me then to not take it personally or to take those feelings and have an unconscious reaction that then gets played out in a retaliatory way, if that makes sense.
yeah, I mean, you should be answering the questions, Rich, like, because that is a brilliant summary of what I mean by it. I've learned a lot from psychoanalytic writing, psychodynamic theory, and I'm really, taken by the Donald Winnicott's work and his wife Claire, who were writing, in the 50s and 60s into the 70s. And they write a lot about the dynamics of relationships between professionals, well, social workers as well. I mean, they did a lot that was relevant to psychotherapy and so on. But, Donald and Claire was professor of social work at LSE. Donald wrote a lot about social workers and spoke at lots of social work conferences and so on. So their work is really quite famous for recognizing the presence of hate in helping relationships. And, drawing on all kinds of psychoanalytic insights, they regard love and hate as being present in every relationship, especially intimate relationships and every professional relationship. So, I'd imagine every social worker listening to this will have had the experience of, some days service users, rejecting them, being angry with them. And they go back and see them and they're not like that. You don't retaliate. It's important not to retaliate. And so, you're acting as a container for the service users' inner world. You become a hate object for them in those moments. Yeah. And you become a reliable hate object by not rejecting them, because that's likely to have been what happened to them historically in their childhoods and so on. So you're helping them to repair some of the trauma, heal from some of the trauma, by being reliable, by being accepting of what they're projecting into you. And that's a therapeutic relationship. And that's, I think what social workers are really good at doing that. Keeping going back, being reliable. And it's hard, but it's, it's at the core of it.
That was a very interesting question and answer. Not necessarily quick fire, but nonetheless, that was really fascinating. Do you have what's your writing process, Harry? Like, how do you get yourself going and motivated and writing when you're writing your books?
I think something that I can write pretty quickly, but keep editing and editing and editing. And I think something I think I've developed a bit more patience over the years. I've been doing this for a long time. This book that I've got coming out, it's available at the end of November. It's taken several years. And there was a time when I couldn't tolerate that. I wouldn't have, and in writing journal articles and so on, I'd be sort of, we're all keen to see these things, get them out there, and so I take longer now. I sit with things longer. I craft them, and I can work at any time of the day or night. I've had lots of interesting conversations with people over the years about the best time for them to do the writing and all that, but I just get in the zone and I don't want to leave the zone, I love the creative process. And, that feeling that, goodness me, where did that come from? Like, and crafting something and just, trying to create something that, feels right, even though other people mightn't agree with that. They might have a completely different view of it. But I've got great pleasure out of that over the years.
This question might be more in alignment with what you were initially expecting. What is your morning routine?
I'm trying to think, what is it? Yeah, Goodness me, why is my morning? Well, it's changed. I don't know what it is anymore. I don't have one. I stopped working at the university. What date is this? We're in September. I stopped working 4 months ago, so it's completely different to what it was. Like like all of us, I worked far too much, and I'd often be up early at the emails and all the rest of it. And so on working days, my routine has completely been change now because I don't have to get up. It's like there's a downside to being old. Let me be honest about that too. But so I've got more time on my hands now. And, I love my iPhone and I spend a lot of time reading The Guardian. Love The Guardian. And just scrolling and I always take my wife a cup of tea in the morning.
Wow, that's a good that's a good daily practice.
You know what I mean? And it's I'm just remaking it at the moment.
Well, fascinating. And but you still are writing. And what's your take on retirement, Harry? 'Cause you're obviously still active and publishing your book, etc.
I'm generally against it. I think we all should be productive, but I struggle with it. But I'm only 4 months into it. But I've had a lot of health problems. I've had 2 liver transplants. The last one was 2 years ago. So I'm trying to kind of stay alive. Really, I'm a great advocate because I'd be dead if it wasn't for the fact that I'd have been dead in 2004 if I hadn't found a donor, a liver organ donor. 2 years ago, I'd have died without a donor. So I'm a passionate advocate for organ donation and, people going on the organ donation register and letting their loved ones know their wishes and so on. So I've stopped working so that I can learn to take better care of myself and actually take better care of myself because I've definitely overworked over the years and, not really invested enough in taking care of myself. So I've got wonderful children and grandchildren and, fortunate to have a wonderful partner. So I want to be around for them.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to manage the transition from a work identity to a different one, and
Wow, and we've caught you in that moment of flux and transition. But
liminality, liminals.
There we go, the liminal space. Yeah.
The last question from me is: when you look back on your career, was there a time that, when you look back, was especially kind of exciting or intriguing, or where you learned a lot?
That's a great question. I think there's definitely been phases to my career. I started out as a social worker, did my PhD, got my first academic job in 1990, kind of got promotions, became a professor in 2000. And I've been thinking a lot about what is a good life in social work, I think I'd like maybe to go there next in terms of what is it to have what does it mean to have a good life?
Mm.
I've had a good life, I'm 69 now and, social work has given me so much, a bit like you talk about in Messy Social Work, Rich, certain personal experiences kind of, motivated me to go into it. Even at an unconscious level, I wasn't, it took me a while to figure out why did I become a social worker. I think the way that you write about your personal experience in that book is absolutely extraordinary. It's amazing. So, thanks for that. I think it's a real service to social work education and practice. I've had some high moments and I've had some difficult moments, but I've been thinking a lot about the totality of it, because I'm trying to step away from it in a way. And I've been just so lucky and fortunate to work with great people and to be able to be involved with so many people who've let me into their lives as a social worker and as a researcher.
What helps you be a good collaborator then, Harry, do you think? And just on that as a final question.
I'm not sure I am a good collaborator. I like working on my own. You're allowed to say that. Oh, yeah. Well, I've enjoyed scholarship, you know. That's what I meant by that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've written an awful lot on my own. I think I've enjoyed being locked away in a room at a computer, but I've had some great collaborations as well, and you know, with colleagues on research projects, and
yeah,
you know, I definitely love the social work community, and I really regret the demise of Twitter in that regard.
yeah,
And
yeah.
you know, I think we're still struggling to find a replacement for it. And
When you've always been able to, you know, make a link with a local authority, have a social worker agree for you to go out and travel with them to a visit, and it's just you've
all
always
right,
managed to make those links, and and
yeah,
that's relational practice as well, isn't it? Yeah,
that's nice to hear. Yeah, I've been very lucky to work with, to meet really generous people who've, you know, and who've tolerated me, like sort of let me into their worlds, you know, and I love doing it. You know, I got a real passion for the smell of practice, like, you know, getting out,
yeah.
and I love getting alongside social workers and going into offices, and I love the culture, and you know, there are parts to it that are just like really problematic and need to change, and but at its core, you know,
Well,
just love
well,
with social workers and with you guys, you know, like I
well.
just
Talking of tolerating people, we're so grateful you've tolerated us because we've come with our books and our questions, and it's been a treat to hear about the book, and then for you to take us through those answers there. And really, thanks so much for giving the time. And I know we've got lots of people tuning in week by week, and I know that this will be a special one for lots of people that have read your work over the years. And so, thanks so much, Harry. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Harry.
no, honestly, thanks ever so much. You're both lovely, and that's definitely been most enriching kind of conversations I've ever had about, certainly about the book Protecting Children in Time, which you both clearly, you know, I'm being serious. You took your task so seriously, and how you fit this into a busy working life. Goodness me. Thanks for everything you do, and thanks for including me. Thanks to everybody who's tolerated me over the years.
That's a good moment to bring it to a close. So I'll press pause at that point. Yeah.
All right.